When did a gut feeling save your life? It was Christmas Day. I'm driving to my parents at 6 a.m. It's extremely dark out when I see a horrible accident in front of me taking up the two right lanes. Both vehicles don't have their hazard lights on. I pull in front of them, switch my hazard lights on, and get out of my car on the freeway hoping I can help them and make sure they're okay. I'm walking toward the first driver 18 over 19 who has blood all over him. He asks me to help him talk to 911 because he spoke broken English. Then I go to the second driver 60s and see if he's okay, who just blames me for the accident. I just responded I didn't do it. The operator then tells me to get everyone on the side of the freeway, which is only 2 to 3 feet from the slowest lane point. Suddenly I have this gut feeling to look to my left, and as I do, I see a SUV racing toward us, and I suddenly realize he's not going to stop, and he's about to hit the first vehicle. The rest happened within a few seconds. The only thing I can think of is get out of the way, and the only way was to go backwards. At the time I didn't know, but there was an overpass behind us. As I'm about to fully fall back, I bothered to look where I was falling and saw how far the drop was. I reasoned I was either going to get hit by the SUV or be crippled from the fall and get hit by a car below me. Fat nope from my part. I hurled myself back up, and as I'm doing so, I watch the SUV hit my leg. The only thing I'm thinking is relax, relax, relax. Point. I came out with no injuries and the young man wasn't hit. Unfortunately, the older man next to me was hit and killed on impact. After hitting the man, the guy in the SUV, 65 plus, hit my car and then swerved through all 5 lanes of traffic and crashed into the center divider. He stayed in his car for a while, and when he tried to get out, he was frantic and tried to cross all 5 lanes while cars were going by. I screamed and told him please not to cross. The guy that was hit was knocked like 100 foot from where we were standing, past where my car was parked. His shoes, socks, money, everything was scattered across the freeway. The worst part of witnessing it was the skid marks of his blood on the freeway, and his brain matter was in one little pile. All this was happening while I was still on the phone with 911. The operator asked me what happened and asked me if I could drag his body off the freeway. I couldn't do it. I was afraid someone else might not see the accident, hit my car, and then me. Point. It's been over a year since the accident and the police report isn't out yet. The guy in the SUV has insurance and a lawyer though. After the accident, a CHP told me that he's seen accidents like this where the Good Samaritan was killed trying to help. Takeaway from this: do not get out of your vehicle on the freeway. Point. Edited with further details. Thank you so much for the silver. When I was in college, I lived in a sketchy part of Chicago, Humboldt Park/Logan Square before gentrification. I liked to take late night strolls, even when I was living in that neighborhood as a 20-year-old woman. Yeah, I know. Pretty dumb of me. One night, I was feeling stressed out, so I embarked on one of my late night strolls. I was walking along a somewhat busy road. Cars were zooming past me. Pretty normal. I wasn't paying much attention because I was too wrapped up in whatever was stressing me out that night. Suddenly, a chill shot up my spine. Hypervigilance washed over me, and I became more alert than I had ever been. Something was wrong. Someone was watching me. I quickly spotted a car. It was driving in the opposite direction, a little slower than usual. It was too dark for me to see anyone inside the car, and the car was pretty unassuming. But I still knew something was off. They were watching me. I just knew. The car drove past me and then made a U-turn. Now it was right behind me, creeping along the curb. Luckily, there was a Walgreens a few blocks ahead. I started walking faster, and the car eventually sped past me and disappeared into a corner. I somehow knew I wasn't safe yet, so I still sprinted to Walgreens. I told the security guard what happened, and we both went outside. The car was parked up the street, about 50 to 100 feet away. The security guard was a big guy who looked intimidating. He marched toward the car, and the car immediately backed up, made a U-turn, and then booked it out of there. The security guard called the cops, and they drove me home. I never took a late night stroll again. My gut made me more alert, but it was really the security guard who saved my life. I'm positive that if he wasn't there that night, something bad would have happened to me. I wish I could find that security guard to thank him. My roommate, I will call him Mike, had just acquired a new girlfriend, Mandy, and she initially struck me as a very disingenuous and shady person. Mike and I are in the military, so we didn't have a whole lot of money to begin with. However, Mike decides to offer Mandy $3,000 simply because she asked him for it. What's worse is that Mike was going to take out a personal loan to give her this money. Mandy was always talking about herself and how she needed money for this, that and the other, and my bleeding heart roommate fell for every line that she gave him, so pretty much she was using him. So my girlfriend Rachel, now wife, decides she wants to visit in Mike, Rachel, and I decide that we are going to go mudding in Mike's Jeep. We pick up Mandy along the way, which is in an extremely poor part of town, and we all head out to the woods. It was at this point that my spider senses started to tingle, and what was particularly odd is that Mandy was demanding that we go to a particular spot deep in the woods that she knew of. This was about 4 to 5 miles inside some deep woods and was not along the usual beaten path. Rachel and I start getting this awful feeling, and we knew something was wrong. We suddenly come upon a group of about 6 well-built tall guys, and Mandy says, "Stop, I know these guys." Mandy hops out of the Jeep and hugs one of the guys, a type of hug that is more than just friends. This is when a feeling of dread came over Rachel and myself. All 6 of the guys were looking at the Jeep and then looking at us with a look that only your enemy would give you. At this point I knew death was imminent. I reached up and locked the front passenger door on mine. Rachel locked hers, and I started yelling at Mike, "Get the fuck out of here, or we are going to die." Rachel was yelling at him also, so Mike caved in and hit the gas. We drive down the road for about a mile, twisting and turning down several side roads. When our adrenaline subsided a bit, we noticed we had a flat back left tire. Turns out the tire had been slashed by one of those guys. That was the quickest I've ever changed a tire in my entire life. Rachel and I knew that death was imminent if we didn't leave. It wasn't a suspicion. It wasn't a guess. It was a full knowing that we were going to die. Turns out Mandy was dating one of those guys and admitted that fact later to Mike. Maybe it saved my life, but it mostly in fact saved me from a car accident. Point preface: I have bad luck in an odd way. I'm not superstitious, but for example I have bet on black 15 times in a row, increasing my bet, and had it be red, +1 green, 15 times in a row. This is amongst many other stories, but really, bad luck. Point story: less than 1 week ago, nearly behind my local grocery store is a street leading to a light, leading very close to my home. It's a pain of a light to sit at. Sometimes it will skip your light. Sometimes you need to go straight, but the guy behind you is making a right, and it's awful just waiting there for this slow light so everyone can get home. It's something I deal with, but it's really not too bad. Well, on this day I was driving down that not so busy street, and the light was green from 50 yards away. I'm making my way to the light, modest speed. My first thought was, there's no way I make the light. I get within 25 yards, and I'm starting to realize I'm going to make the light. Honestly, this faking gets me. I'm like, praise this faking day, I just saved 4 minutes of my life by strolling through this long green like I own the road. Then, some faked up sheet-brained anxiety riddled good vibe ruining thought occurs to me. What if I get so full of myself driving through the Hail Mary of green lights and someone pulls in front of me? So I cut my speed a little. I'm going to cruise through the intersection, and some fuckhead is running the red light. We both slam on the brakes and miss collision by a few feet. I was pissed, followed by pretty amazed of myself for calling it. As a footnote, the anxiety from the near accident ruined the rest of my day. When I was in the army, we spent 3 weeks in Panama for jungle training. The terrain down there is a nightmare, nothing but steep hills. You try to stick to the ridges if you can, but unfortunately they rarely run in the direction you're traveling. On our last day in the field, we were moving to set up an ambush when we came to the ridge of a hill, roughly 200 meters from top to bottom, with about a 45-degree slope. We really should have rappelled down it, but we lacked the rope to do it properly. Instead, we start carefully picking our way down the hill while carrying about 65 pounds of gear. About halfway down the hill, I slipped Had that frantic moment where my arms are pinwheeling while I'm trying to catch my balance, but luckily I stumbled against this spindly little sapling of a tree, just a couple of feet tall. It was just barely big enough to stop my slide and let me regain my balance point. While I'm doing that, I hear a guy at the top of the hill yell rock, meaning he's just kicked a rock loose and it's now tumbling down the hill. I look back, but don't see anything, so I shrugged and turned back to continue my journey down the hill. Okay, so this is the weird part. Even to this day I can't explain it. I'll just tell it the way I remember it and let you draw your own conclusions as I'm preparing to head down the hill. I swear I heard a little voice in the back of my head, you know, you might just want to take another look up that hill. Okay, so I turned to take another look, and this time I spotted the rock. It was about the size of a bowling ball, moving at a pretty good clip, and it must have just hit something and bounced because when I spotted it the rock was about 2 feet from my face and zooming in for the kill. I think I reacted the way most people would. I screamed cheat and tried to dive out of the way. I almost made it. Damn thing clipped my elbow and threw me straight back, and the only thing that stopped me was that same little spindly sapling I'd bumped into the first time. I thought I'd shattered my elbow, and I'm hollering like a stuck pig, but thankfully I was only badly bruised. Thing is, if I hadn't turned around for another look, that rock would have either snapped my neck or thrown me down the hill to let gravity do the work. Either way, that little voice probably saved my life, and like I said, I still can't explain it. Sunset Highway, mile marker 5, Seaside, Oregon. When I was 16 my dad took me deep sea fishing in Alwaco, Washington. We left our house in Portland, stupid early in the morning, 2 a.m., to get to the dock in time to depart by 4:30 a.m. We had a fun day out, caught loads of fish, and were on the road driving home in the early afternoon. I fell asleep about 30 minutes into our drive. I remember waking up, my dad singing to the radio, eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. My heart is pounding, and then totally clearly I hear in my head, tell your dad to put his seatbelt on. I distinctly remember feeling teen embarrassment and mentally voicing, what the heck? No way, I'm not going to tell my dad what to do. After a couple minutes and more of my dad serenading me to some Willie Nelson song, I hear the voice again, this time very directly, tell your dad to put his seatbelt on and tell him right now. I begrudgingly oblige and say, Dad, you should probably put your seatbelt on. He says, oh shoot, thanks, silly that I even need the reminder. And he buckles up and goes on singing and munching on his PBJ. I smile, my heartbeat settles down, I close my eyes and lean my head against the window and promptly fall asleep. The next time I open my eyes, I'm staring at the coins that were resting on the dashboard, now floating in slow motion in front of me. I see my hands are outstretched, and for some reason they make contact with the windshield. Sunshine is flashing like a strobe light, refracting off thousands of tiny chunks of glass, but also, there's dirt. Why is there dirt floating in the air, in our car? I'm very confused. My hearing comes crashing back as this memory shifts to real time, and I can hear my dad yelling for me, the engine whining, and the screech of bending metal, the crunch of breaking glass. I can smell the dirt, the engine oil, rubber. It dawns on me we've been rolling. We finally come to a stop, and we are tipped sideways, with the driver's side up in the air. I'm disoriented, but somehow coherent. My dad is in shock and confused, asking where I am. I'm able to unbuckle myself and crawl out through the now missing windshield, and after a bit of a wrestle, I help my dad get unbuckled, even though all his weight is on his seatbelt buckle. He's bleeding pretty badly on his arm, but he says he's fine as we both scamper up the hill to the road. Traffic has stopped, and there's now a crowd of people who gasp as we make it up roadside. We watched it all happen in slow motion. We just knew there wouldn't be survivors. Multiple people tell us, you need to sit down, you're not looking good. One man tells me, I feel fine, but my ears are ringing, and my right ear is bloody to the touch. My dad is really dazed, and keeps asking for me, even though I'm sitting right next to him, telling him I'm fine, and I'm right here. It starts to dawn on me how crazy this all is as I look down, and see just how far we climbed up to the road. We must have rolled 5 times after flying off the road at 60 miles per hour. Onlookers said we hit a tree not long after we departed the road, which slowed us down but sent us rolling toward the small river below. First responders arrive. They're all in disbelief. We walked away. As we're being lifted into the ambulance, my dad says to the firefighter who had bandaged his arm, "Please, somewhere down there's a cooler full of fresh salmon. It's all yours." I'd hate to see it go to waste. I always wondered if they actually went looking for it, and if they have a shared memory of remember that time that father and son bailed off the road and gave us their salmon. That was the best BBQ ever. We were whisked off to the hospital to get checked out. "You are unbelievably lucky," the paramedics kept telling us. "It's not called the bloody highway for nothing," says his partner. At the one of them pulled my dad aside and said, "When you go to collect your things from the tow yard, you may experience some pretty intense emotions seeing the vehicle." Despite this warning, we were totally unprepared for the flood of emotions. While walking up to our mangled, shredded, the cabin roof was totally peeled open. Ford Ranger pickup point. My dad and I often reflect back on this and make the occasional pilgrimage to El Waco. He thanks me at least once a year for listening to that voice, and my kids regularly ask for a retelling of that time you saved your dad's life. And I tell it again and again. And I tell them I'm grateful teen embarrassment lost that battle so they can grow up knowing my old man, edit, fixed the Google Maps link. I decided to waste time before heading home, since I skipped out on work at the time and went to a plaza near where I used to work. I stopped at a couple stores before hitting a Party City. It was near Halloween time, so I wanted to see what they had out. But, mind you, the area I was in was completely unsafe. It was known for a bit of human trafficking activity. I'm a 20-year-old female who is 5 feet 0 and weighs about 110 lbs. I'm quite small, but I thought I'd be okay just checking the store out because the other two I went to were fine and I didn't get any weird vibes from them. So I parked my car at the end of the parking lot in front of the store, closest to the road. It was all I could get. I went in and just started to look around. There was a couple families, so I felt fine up until I went down an aisle near the front and saw a man on the phone who was looking very uninterested at the thing he was gazing at with another lady. He glanced at me and wouldn't stop looking at me. He spoke Spanish, so I couldn't make out what he was saying. Since my Spanish is pretty limited despite living in Arizona for so long, I started to feel uneasy, so I went toward the back into the next aisle, thinking my mind was just in overdrive since I was supposed to be at work and that's where my parents thought I was. I finished looking down the aisle and once I got to the back, the same lady that was with the man was already standing back there, as if she was waiting for me. I smiled at her and nodded in my head, as I do in respect when I make eye contact with someone. I thought it would be a good way to show her that I've seen her face enough to know what she looks like. So I went back down the aisle again and saw the man standing to the side near the front. I noticed a lady finishing checking out and rushed over behind her. The moment she walked out, I did too, and I hauled us to my car and quickly started to drive away towards the freeway. I really felt uncomfortable and I thought maybe I was being overdramatic, but the only reason I knew about the activity there was because a couple weeks after the incident, there were reports of a few areas in Phoenix regarding human trafficking. And that area was one of them. So, never again. Here's one. The wife had crashed her car. After a month she got an insurance payout, and after a brief search she found about 100 kilometers from our place in Sydney, Australia. I wasn't keen. The weather forecast was for storms, quite strong ones apparently, but she was insistent, which is a tale for another day. So we drive down to Sydney. Now, the seller was a guy who'd just closed his car yard down and had just a few vehicles to sell, keeping them at home. Wife looked at the vehicle, liked it a lot, took it for a short drive, all good. While that was going on, and the drawing up of paperwork, a few people were coming out and covering their cars with thick blankets. A severe storm warning with large hail had been issued. I thought I'd better move my car under a tree and hopefully avoid the worst of it. I love my car and didn't want it written off due to hail damage, as had happened to people I know. So I get to it just as the rain truly begins to bucket down huge amounts, and then the wind starts thrashing the trees, really thrashing them. and I realized the tree I'm parked under, which had multiple trunks, 4 or 5, is rocking to and fro. And my gut instinct said, hey law not, you can't stay here. So I rolled my car forward about 4 meters and looked in my rear vision mirror in time to see the tree crash on the road behind me. Close enough to put a large scratch near the petrol cap, but no other damage. And in 10 meters in front of me, I turned around to see an enormous tree had crashed right across the road, pulling down power lines. When I went back to pick up the wife, the car salesman's garage had a tree go through it, crushing 2 of their cars, though not the one she was buying. We drove home, picking it up after the money was sorted in a few days, and on the way the suburbs were a mess. The damage was crazy. Turns out 2 supercells had met over the city, and where we were was literally ground zero. Could not have been in a worse place. So in conclusion, I was very glad I listened to my gut. People who lived across the road and saw the tree fall were convinced I was under it and were about to call emergency services. I never win a lottery or a big prize, but I love my grandkids, the lights in my life, and sometimes I get lucky in other ways. Below is a link to a local paper that reports just how big it was. https://www.northernster.com.au. When I was in my early 20s, my grandmother became ill with cancer. I had moved across the country few years prior, but she had basically raised me, and I wasn't doing anything in my new city except waiting tables. So I moved back to help take care of her. She was receiving hospice care pretty quickly into my stay, and there was often a night nurse that would come in, so I could get some sleep. I would also sometimes use these nights to meet up with a dude I had waited tables with before I had moved away. We had run into one another one day when I was out getting groceries, made a date, and things got pretty hot and heavy right away. We were both in some emotional turmoil. He was stuck living with an ex because he couldn't afford a place on his own, and it was nice to just have some fun. After a day of reading to my grandmother, cooking food she couldn't eat, giving her meds, bathing her, missing her even though she was technically still with me, it was good to forget for a little bit. For obvious reasons, we couldn't really meet at his place or my place, so we had to get creative. For some reason I don't remember, I had my mom's car that night, a convertible red Marta. It was late fall and still warm, and we decided to go for a drive out an old highway away from the city and look for a place to park. The road is very windy and dark without a lot of shoulder. We eventually settled on an empty gravel parking lot next to a church. There was one light attached to the building that illuminated some of the parking lot and a little bit of the big field behind the church. I parked the car. The top was down to give us more room, and we proceeded to go after it like a couple of high school kids. Thank goodness that car was way too small to get serious, no real backseat to get into. We were deep into each other, but something made me break away and look out into the field. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black beyond the circle of light provided by that one bulb. Kissing again, but I kept feeling drawn to that field. I looked again, and this time I definitely saw something. I nudged the guy I was with. Do you see that? He looked, and the shape of man became distinguishable in the shadows of the field. No shirt, running all hunched and low to the ground, zigzagging back and forth but definitely heading toward us. And laughing. By some miracle I had left the keys in the ignition. I started in the car, threw it in reverse, and peeled out of the parking lot, spitting gravel everywhere. The shirtless guy chased us down the road, sprinting, arms pumping, trying to catch us, even though there was no way. We lost him going around a curve. We didn't say anything the whole way back to the city, and things were weird between us afterwards. He decided to try and work it out with his ex. My grandma passed a few weeks later, and I ended up back out west. On one late evening, I was driving home on a dark parkway with no street lights. After driving several miles with lights only supported my headlights and a few other cars, the cars were exiting the parkway one by one and the night became even more grave. With only a few more miles left till my exit, there was only one car left behind me and the other car. Okay, share the road right. My exit appears. I turn on my signal, because I still have driving etiquette. Seconds later, the other car also signals and exits behind me. Okay, what a coincidence. We must Live in the same area. Big neighborhood with houses, townhouses, apartments, and condos. Turn after turn, it keeps following me into now my neighborhood. Oh wow, I'm freaking out now. I don't know what to do, not a single soul outside. I turn into my street, and it's still behind me. What the fuck do I do? Do I call the cops? My gut feeling told me to not park into my driveway because there is no time for me to run into the house, nor would it be wise to actually give away the actual house I live in. So I drove past my house, and before I turn at the end of the street, I look at the rear mirror and the car has parked into a driveway. Holy shit, are they going to wait for me? I need to call a friend and go somewhere else. What about my family, who's already in the house sleeping? I wait a bit and look exactly at which house the car parked at. I found out it was my neighbor. Relieved and laughing at myself, I circle the block and go back to my own freaking house and call it a night. Till this day though, I'm still proud that I played it safe, then be sorry had it gone south. When I was around 12, my parents and I traveled the country. We ended up midway down the east coast, in a rainforest area called Nature's Valley, near the town Howick. No woods, just pure free green luscious forest, Tarzan-style vines and all. The small campsite was quite a ways into the wilderness, surrounded by trees and ferns, but was peaceful and pretty safe, as it was private property. We were all allowed to take walks through the forest, and up the hill, and to the waterfall. Only the groundskeeper actually stayed anywhere near there, and he was a pretty nice guy, a very honest and open old man. All in all, safe point. I decided one afternoon to walk down the hill instead of up through the forest as I usually did, as I hadn't gone downhill much. As I was nearing the entrance to the property, a dusty faded backy pickup truck stopped right by the gate. There were about 8 men in the vehicle, 2 in the cab and 6 in the back, and I knew something wasn't right. They hadn't seen me yet, but their clothes didn't fit the scene of the campsite. Their shirts were stained and full of holes, and in general looked like the sort of people a 12-year-old girl would want to stay away from. But I'm not prejudiced. I knew something was wrong, but I wasn't about to run away without provocation. Bad move. I should have listened to my gut. Obviously one of them saw me, because he said something to the others, and they all jumped out the vehicle and over the gate. I've never run so fast in my life. I'd been on the track team while in school, but 2 years in homeschooling with no activity makes anyone unfit. But still, when you know you're running probably for more than just your life, it doesn't matter how unfit you are. They were right behind me, and I jumped off the path and into the thorn bushes despite being barefoot. It didn't matter. Long grass, hot summer day in Africa, equals snakes. Deadly ones. I hope they'd come to the same conclusion and stop running after me. They didn't. I was leaping over rocks. Somehow I didn't fall, or twist an ankle, or worse, get caught. As soon as the campsite came into view, they all suddenly stopped and watched me run flat into the trees near where we were camped up. They didn't come back, and my parents didn't believe me, despite the dozens of thorns still stuck in my legs and feet, and the scratches I had all over myself from the lower tree branches. Still, I didn't go near that gate again until the moment we drove away. I was maybe 5 to 6 years old, had bronchitis due to a bacterial infection, was being treated with antibiotics. The night after I took the second dose, I'm lying awake coughing, and I suddenly start to feel really weird. Couldn't say what, but something just felt wrong. I decided I should get up and go to my parents' room. My chest felt tight and itchy as I got out of bed. By the time I made it to the door of my bedroom, my airway had started to swell shut, and it was getting very difficult to breathe. By the time I made it into my parents' room, I was barely getting any air at all. My limbs and face were starting to feel tingly from lack of oxygen. It felt like someone big was kneeling on my chest and squeezing my throat. I had to shake my mother awake, because I couldn't even speak. By the time the ambulance arrived, I was losing consciousness from oxygen deprivation. I woke up in the hospital and was informed that I'd had an extremely severe allergic reaction. We eventually deduced that I was reacting to the antibiotics I was prescribed. We hadn't noticed the milder allergy symptoms I'd had after the first dose because I had a cough and chest pain already due to the bronchitis, and I'd thought the hives on my legs were just bug bites and the reaction had almost killed me. If I hadn't gotten up when I did, I might have lost consciousness before I was able to wake my parents up, and most likely wouldn't have survived. I started carrying an EpiPen with me after that, and haven't taken that specific type of antibiotics since. Apparently, it's a documented thing that someone having a severe allergic response will sometimes experience an intense feeling of dread before it really starts. Well, not sure how common it is, but it sure as shit saved my life there. It didn't save my life, but I'm almost certain it saved someone else's. For background info, my spouse was killed over the summer in a motorcycle accident. One day I was leaving school and got onto the highway to go home. I was the right lane, a box truck was in the middle lane, left lane was empty. There were virtually no vehicles in front of or behind us. I really don't like to pass vehicles from the right lane, but I wanted to get in front of the box truck so I could cruise in the middle lane for the rest of the trip home. My plan was to merge behind the box truck, then merge into the left lane to pass, and then get into the middle lane in front of the truck to cruise. Like I mentioned already, I put my hand up to hit the blinker, and I heard a voice loud and clear in my mind that said it can wait. It wasn't my normal thinking voice, so I thought to myself, okay, that's fine. Right then, a motorcycle sped up behind that box truck exactly where I was about to merge. He practically came out of nowhere. I always look like 40 times before crossing lanes by checking all 3 mirrors and turning my head to check my blind spots. If I had changed lanes when I intended to, he would have smashed into the back of my car because he was going much faster than me, or I would have plowed into him the side. No amount of yielding or signaling would have prevented this motorcycle guy past the truck on the left and sped through traffic until I could no longer see him. I did what I needed to do and drove home as usual. I've only heard that voice once before in my life and never since that incident. Both times it managed to save me a lot of grief. It wasn't mine, it was my wife's. I was on the road working and had checked into a hotel in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and just gotten into my room. It was a little after 10 o'clock, and as I was setting my stuff down, my cell phone rang with my wife calling me from Chesapeake, Virginia. I answered the phone and the first words out of my wife's mouth were, "Where are you?" I told her I was standing in a hotel room and she said, "Where's your truck at?" I told her it was in a parking lot across the road. By road I mean 6 lanes of traffic going at 45 miles per hour with a 5-foot median in the middle, and asked her if there was a problem. She took a deep breath and said, "I know this is going to sound crazy, but is there any way you can sleep in the cab of your rig tonight?" I told her that I had already paid for the room and wanted a shower, and she was like, "Okay, take a shower, check out, and then go back to your truck. Try to get a refund, but if they don't give you one, fuck it. I just want you to sleep in your rig tonight. Will you do it for me, please? I just have a really bad feeling about it." I agreed to what she asked, went back to the hotel room, got my stuff, checked out, went back to my rig, climbed into my bunk, called her back and said, "Okay, I'm in my rig, so you can quit faking worrying now. Go back to sleep. I'm going to try, and I'll call you in the morning." About 6 AM the next morning, my alarm goes off. I crawl out of my bunk, put my boots on, get out of my truck, and look across the street at the hotel, and all I see is cop cars, police tape, and news crews. I walk back across the street towards the hotel, and go to the Denny's next to it for breakfast, and see the clerk who had checked me in and out, sitting there. So I asked what happened. She just looked up at me, shook her head, and said, "I don't know where you went or why, but you should be thankful." I asked her again what happened, and she said that a little after 4 AM that morning, some people got into a shootout in the parking lot. I asked her what that had to do with me, and she said, "About an hour after you left, I checked another guy into that room. When the shootout happened, it was right in front of that room, and one of the bullets busted the window and hit him as he was laying there in the bed. They carried him out in a bag under a sheet. The next thing I did was call my wife, told her I loved her, and apologized for snapping at her. I was backpacking in the Yukon Territory in Canada, which has a lot of grizzly bears. I was walking along the top of a mountain with big 10-foot boulders everywhere, which isn't typically where you find bears cause there weren't any plants or other animals for the bears to eat. Because of this we weren't being loud like we normally would, to not accidentally surprise a bear, but, for some reason, when I was looking at a huge 20-foot boulder I decided to yell "Hey bear." Immediately you can hear movement on the other side of a boulder and out saunters a gigantic grizzly bear and a second smaller one. The big one starts to fake charge us, but stops about 10 feet away. He stands up on his back paws and towers over us close to twice our height. We yelled at it and came together into a group, so he backed off. He goes about 15 feet and hides behind a shrub that is about half his size and is staring at us. We kept telling, and eventually they both ran off. We think they might have been there mating, and if we had walked by the boulder we would have surprised them and had them cornered in what was essentially a small cave under the boulder. This would almost certainly have gotten a violent response, and the closest hospital was 3 hours by helicopter away, which means they won't get back to the hospital for at least 6, more likely 7 to 8 hours. The gut instinct to yell out stopped us from surprising them and stopped an almost certain mauling by 2 grizzly bears. I was much younger and dumber. The actions that happened were a direct result of being dumb. Still, nonetheless, my body knew what was about to go down. 2 buddies, Jay and A, and myself decided to go camping on a whim and drove a few hundred miles to a state park in Virginia. The passenger, A, and myself had been drinking and the driver, J, was just a careless teenager. Well, while we were sipping through the state park, many hairpin turns, and a very narrow trail at that, the passenger, A, and myself decided to stand on the back seats and hang out from the sunroof. Well, something went wrong. One of us hit the driver's arm, causing him to spin out of control. A was thrown from the vehicle, but something told me to hold on. I just remember being frozen and staring out over the mountainside thinking, if this car goes over I'm done. I held on so tight I had left finger indents on the car's roof. When the car finally came to a rest by hitting a wall, we assessed the damage. Car was totaled. J had a concussion. I had broken ribs from hitting the side of the sunroof, but A had hit the side of the sunroof on his way out and was losing a lot of blood. We were stuck in the middle of nowhere, no cell service, when a park ranger pulled up. Said he had heard the crash from over a mile away. A ended up being medevac from the side of the mountain, and J and I left in ambulances. If I had not had the instinct to just hold on, I don't know what would have happened. I don't condone what we did, and I highly advise against it. Though till this day I can still remember time moving slower and just holding on for dear life. I was driving home from work when I hit a part of the highway that was full of heavy construction. The lines for the lanes had recently been repainted, but you could still see the faint old lines on the road. Because of that, people normally slow down below the speed limit, since it was hard to tell which line was new and which was old. As I was driving through the construction, I was almost sideswiped by an SUV that was matching speeds with me in the left lane. I had a really bad feeling and slowed down even more to let this car go ahead of me. Once I was behind him, the SUV drifted into my lane and frantically corrected itself a few seconds later. He had a hard time staying in the lane, after which could have been because of the lines that had just been painted. But the bad feeling wouldn't go away. I was beginning to get scared that he was going to cause an accident and stayed as far as I could behind him, so I could keep my eye on the car as we neared the end of the construction zone. There was a part where there was a break in the concrete barriers off to the left side where the construction crew could get their cars or trucks in. The guy in the SUV started to drift again, this time to the left towards the break in the barrier. He wasn't slowing down either. My heart started racing as he went off the road and head first into the barrier without even braking. The force of the impact sent his car flying backwards towards my car. My body automatically reacted and pulled the steering wheel to the right into an exit lane that thankfully had no one in it. If I hadn't done that, the back wheel of the SUV would have hit the windshield right where I was sitting. I was running on adrenaline and didn't think to stop right after. I looked in my mirror and saw that the SUV was faced sideways on the road, taking up both lanes of traffic. I spent the rest of the drive in a complete daze thinking about the what ifs that could have happened if I hadn't gotten that bad feeling and decided to keep an eye on that guy's car. I never found out what happened to the guy to cause him to run headfirst into the barrier, but I'm always more cautious about driving through construction zones now. So it was the early 90s, and I was 13 at the time, though I looked probably about 9 to 10, and it was the Friday afternoon of Memorial Day weekend, and a buddy and I were opening up packs of baseball cards on the side of the party store we just got them from. A dude in his 40s approaches us and starts to try to make small talk about the baseball cards and such. Our bikes are laying by the side of us, and the stranger starts telling me he has a son that passed, how much I looked like him and so on. Then he says that his son had a bike exactly like mine and wanted me to have it. So my bike was an old Beta 10 speed, and at this point I'm still pretty oblivious and think to myself, why the hell would I want two shitty bikes? I kindly decline, and like a flip of a switch, he starts getting really aggressive and says I need to come with him. At this point my buddy and I are freaked out, and I tell him no, and we are going in the store. We get in the store, which is a family-run Italian joint, and hide somewhere toward the back corner of the store. The counter guys notice us and question what we are doing. We break it down and the oldest one of them goes into superhero mode, jumps over the counter and heads toward the front door. As he's going through the double door, the stranger pulls up in his car like a bat out of hell and seems like he was about to charge to go inside, I presume to snatch me. He noticed the employee coming out the door, got back in the driver, and gunned it out of there. No one got plates in all of it, and probably not the wisest decision, but the store owner tells us to hurry, get home and tell our parents. I get home fine, but decide I'm not going to say anything because it was a holiday weekend. I wanted to be able to go out and hang with my friends. Once school came back around on Tuesday morning, I kind of forgot about it until I was called down to the office, questioned by officers and all that. My parents weren't happy lol. But in my defense, the school/city turned it into a huge deal, made the metro area news and all that. Point summary, stranger danger tried to snatch me, didn't tell my folks, so I could still have a fun weekend. I've told this before, but if it was on Reddit, it was long ago. I used to live in a 200-year-old building. The windows were the old sash weight type and the weights had all broken off. The windows had also been painted. It had been an old opera house, but it had been gutted, and those apartments were thrown together and thrashed. My neighbor was a crazy guy when he took his bipolar medicines, and he loved whatever they had him on. He asked me to help him install an old window AC unit that he had. I went over to lend a hand. We got the window open, and I was holding it. He came running in with the old window AC unit because he was all medicated and thought it would be best to hurry. He slammed the AC unit into the opening and I tried to lower the window down upon it. Apparently, I'd opened the window a bit too much because it was stuck, even though it weighed 50 pounds. Somehow we switched, and I was holding the AC unit on the window ledge, and he was trying to unstick and close the window. I thought, hands, 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 and then something exploded in my brain. Move your hands was the only thought. The voice originating from within the depths of my brain, being impossible to ignore. I moved my hands to allow my neighbor's old AC unit to fall 20 or so feet down to smash on the pavement of the parking lot. This isn't what happened. What happened is the window became suddenly unstuck and came crashing down onto the AC unit the very instant that I'd let it go. I would have broken every bone from my wrists to my fingertips. That window would have shattered my hands. It would have turned them into a plesiosaurus. I probably wouldn't have died, but I bet I'd wish that I had for a while. My neighbor and I figured it was a job well done, and I left. Went into my apartment and told so that I couldn't be so nice anymore and helping people with their shit. If I'm going to break my hands, it has to be at work, so they'll pay me as compensation. There would have been nobody to take care of us. I was driving to school one morning on an icy/rainy day, and I was early because I thought traffic would be bad, but most people had chosen to stay home. I saw that McDonald's was open and decided to stop and have my breakfast inside instead of eating at school. I almost didn't stop because I never ate anywhere but in homeroom, but on this day my brain was telling me to stop and have breakfast, take a few minutes before school, to enjoy my morning point. When I got to school I noticed there was a great deal of police/fire and rescue in the student parking lot where my spot was. I parked on the side of the road and walked down to see. I saw two pretty badly mangled cars and the small oak tree in front of our spots had been felled. Came to learn that one student had come in the lot's front entrance and the second car had come in through the maintenance back entrance. There's a hill in front of the back entrance and the second kid had been speeding, took the hill too fast, and slammed into the other car, which pushed it into the tree, bringing the tree down. It wasn't a huge oak but it big enough that it caved the roofs of both cars. Both drivers were taken by ambulance to the hospital. One kid had a pretty bad skull fracture, broken arm, and a few broken ribs. The other had a terribly bad compound break to his left leg, shattered his left arm, and did something to his back where he couldn't walk for several months, had to use a wheelchair. My parking spot was literally dead center of the accident, and had I been there I would have probably been injured as well. This needs some context first, so bear with me. I must have been maybe 6 or 7 years old at the time, and back then, I was a bit of a worrier. Mostly thanks to my mom constantly worrying and telling me careful, you'll break your neck anytime. I even so much as stood up point in my bedroom. I used to have a big red metal bookcase. If you lived in the UK in the 90s you probably had one. It looked like industrial shelving, but made from Meccano, which was about 6 feet tall and 3 feet from my bed. It was old and beginning to bend and warp out of shape due to the amount of books shoved into any space the shelves could offer. It was there for several months before one night I was laid in bed and a random worry popped into my head. If that thing were to ever collapse, that would hit me and probably kill me. I laid worrying about it for several hours, visualizing where it would land if it did fall over. I realized that if it did, I was screwed, as most of it would come down on my head and torso. Point. I finally got out of bed and quietly and carefully moved my bed about 2 feet further away as to not wake anyone else. I got into bed and again started visualizing its fall. Unsure of my initial predictions I moved it a further foot or so again. After about 30 more minutes of late night anxiety about my impending doom, I finally fell asleep. I was woken up about an hour later by a sound so loud I thought a car had crashed through our house. It was the bookcase tipping over and hundreds of books coming crashing down in unison. It missed my mattress by about 5mm and wedged itself between the wall and my bed frame after the sharp shelf edges had carved into the wooden base of the bed like it was made of butter. Always trust your gut and never be ashamed of being a warrior. That sheet saved my life. I posted this a while back on a similar thread. TLDR at the bottom. Went to a party with some friends. It was in the town over from our, and it was a very nice area. Nice, big house with a spiral staircase. I guess a couple of my friends knew the guy who was throwing the party. I did not. It was a packed party. Everyone was having a good time. Though, as one of my friends mentioned, something was off. There was just a weird vibe in the air. We all agreed. We were only stopping by momentarily because my friend needed to talk to his friend, the party thrower/house owner. Though we were considering staying for a while to party, we finally found him upstairs where there were only a few people plus the 5 of us. They were talking off on their own and we were just bullshitting and waiting. The dude was pissed about something and kept going on about some other guy who was at the party. So at that point my friend is done talking to the dude and was like, yeah, let's get the fuck out of here, fuck this. Everyone agreed, especially at that point, with this angry guy in the same room as us. We were ready to get foe, so we left in a hurry. We were there maybe 10 minutes. A couple days later we heard about how the angry party thrower/owner ended up going after that guy and guns were also involved. Someone was shot, I believe. A whole mess. Like I mentioned above, before we got there we were going to stay for a bit to party, have a good time. But a few minutes after we got there all of us knew that something was up, and we immediately changed our minds about that. And luckily we did. Apparently all that shit went down only about 10 to 15 minutes after we left. Who knows what would have happened to any of the 5 of us had we stayed. TLDR. Went to some guy's party that my friend knew. Right after we got there we all felt that something was just not right. My friend talked to his friend who was the owner slash party thrower, and the dude was angry about something. After that we decided to not stay and get the hell out. Maybe 10 to 15 minutes after we left, the owner confronted a guy at the party and shit went down. Guns involved. Someone was shot. Glad the 5 of us all felt the same vibe and decided to leave. Who knows what could have happened had we not. Back in the late 90s, some friends and I were into inline skating. Don't laugh, it used to be cool. Sort of. Anyhow, we all had similar work shifts and used to go night skating. I used to live in Central California, near Fresno, an ungodly place high in crime. Just throwing that in for reference. So me and my buddies get off work, meet up, and hit the streets like we did 3 to 5 times per week. Our route used to take us quite a few miles through town, down main roads, through parking lots, through parks, bike paths, etc. One of our usual routes took us through a nearby park, where we could throw a few grinds on some park equipment, leap over some decorative rosa bushes, have a little fun with it. Basically, one of us would just take off in a direction, and the rule was to have the rest of the guys, there were usually no more than 3 of us, follow suit. Challenge and fun, if you will. Sorry, rambling about my beloved hobby. Onto the creepy part. So we are blazing down the street, following the lead guy, and we get interrupted by heavy traffic. Damn, we have to actually stop at a light, instead of jaywalk slash skating across the street. Okay, no biggie. It happens. We start talking about the nearby park, and how that's our usual spot, so let's just go there. My buddy Don, lead guy that night, turns to us, and says, nah, let's head over down this street here. The park is looking kinda dark tonight, and we don't want some creep trying to molest us or something. We all turn to look at the park, and sure enough, half the damn lights are out, or have not come on yet. It's 10 PM at this point. Easily. We get a bad feeling about the park, and abandon the idea of going there in favor of just hitting the parking lot across the street, and then heading to wherever the wind took us. No problem. We finish the evening skate session, and head on home, bed. Work the next day, etc. The lead guy, Don, has his mom tell him the next day, we were about 20, but that loser still lived with his parents, that a bum was killed in that park around 9 PM to 12 AM. He was stabbed something like 20 to 30 times. Probably for $3 or something stupid. I've never forgotten that night, and how damn close we might have come to getting killed. All because we were just out having a good time. P. Homeless dude of Merced, California. Also, I've never stopped missing rollerblading. Being old and having a bad back sucks. Don't necessarily know if this is necessarily saving my life, but alas, I'll go on. It was after school one day, when I was around 11/12, I was being a dumb troublemaking youth, and decided to go into a department store with my friend. Let's say his name was Garth. Well, Garth and I were being little jerks, and tossing products around. I was eating some of those goldfish crackers without intending on buying them, just generally being a sheet. This caught the attention of one of those loss prevention officers. Caught us as I was in the middle of shoveling crackers into my mouth and had come to confront us. This scared the shit out of me. Before this I have never really gotten in trouble. Well, as I was getting talked to, Garth completely bailed on me, and I was stuck there to face the punishment. But this is where it got odd. I was pulled behind some racks of clothes to be spoken to, and was told that I could get in a lot of trouble, which scared the absolute life out of me, because my mom would kill me. But I was given an out. I was told if I just gave him a kiss, I could go with no repercussions. Reminder, I'm 11/12, and I have always looked younger than my age. Now, me being young, naive, and scared almost agreed. But this gut feeling I had told me to run, that getting in trouble for stealing is better than kissing this grown man. So I ran away. Honestly, I don't know if this world led to any worse situation other than me kissing this man when I was a child, but I also refused to ever enter that store without my mom, and I also never hung out with Garth again. That faker. Alaska State Trooper here. I was performing a traffic stop on a white Ford Ranger out in the Bonners a couple dozen miles outside of Fairbanks at around 7 AM. This was the middle of winter, so the entire state of Alaska is pitch black until about 9 to 11 AM depending on what part you're in. It was snowing pretty heavily, so I turned on my flashlight and approached the driver's side window of the vehicle. They were missing a rear tail light. There were no other vehicles on this road whatsoever, and this was the first car I had seen since I left Fairbanks at the start of my shift, so I figured it was safe enough for me to stay on the driver's side. I usually do this anyway, but this day, I had a really odd feeling that something was about to happen. Sixth sense or something. So after a few seconds of talking to the driver, an older man who apparently lived off the grid in the area, I walked around to the passenger side window and continued the conversation from there. Not even a few minutes later, a red F-150 comes speeding around the corner and barrels into the driver's side of the Ranger, right where I was standing not 30 seconds earlier. He was going at least 40 miles per hour, so the truck I stopped got pushed back where I was now, and I was leaning into the window, about to take the driver's ID, so I got the air knocked out of me pretty bad, and one of my lower left ribs broken, and I got sent flying back into a snow pile. After a few seconds of being dazed and trying to get some air back in my lungs, I radioed for a Fairbanks officer to come as backup, and I got flown to the nearest hospital for my injuries, along with the driver of the truck I stopped. He wasn't hurt too bad, luckily, suffered a minor concussion. Turned out the driver of the red F-150 blew a .117 back. I was pretty upset about having to miss work because of the injury, but not too bad, because I know it could have been a lot worse. Wasn't my gut feeling but my dad's. My dad lives next to an aggressive neighbor who has anger issues. There were one or two past times when he would get mad at my dad, telling him to fuck off because he was using part of my dad's front garden point. But on a particular occasion, me, my sister, I was about 12 and my sister 14 to 15, and my dad were in the car and were just pulling up to the house where our neighbor was just about to leave in his car. It resulted in a situation where we were both stuck as our neighbor wouldn't reverse back and my dad couldn't reverse back as a hedge blocked the way. So the neighbor got out the car, and like the second my dad saw his car door open, he pretty much instinctively pressed the button to lock all the doors of the car. So the neighbor went round to my dad's door and aggressively pulled on the handle to try open the door. He then pounded on the window trying to smash it with his fist a good 20 times I'd say, and he was going hard. Like, I'm surprised the window didn't smash. By this time my sister and I were also crying point after repeatedly trying to, I guess, smash the window with his fist. He went into his garage and we all saw him pick up a tool which I think was a hammer or wrench, which made me honestly think my dad or all of us was gonna die from getting faked up with the tool, and it terrified the shit out of me point. But, thank fuck, his partner, who is a semi-decent human being, decided to turn up and calm him down and get him to return the tool before shit hit the fan, and I don't wanna think what would have happened if she wasn't there. Police got involved, and my dad didn't press charges, which really pisses me off, because the shit he was giving my dad was insane, and this topped it all off point anyway. Somehow my dad and the neighbor came to an agreement with a firm handshake, and now they're fine with each other, but I still fucking hate that cunt, and he should be behind bars. But yeah, if my dad didn't lock those sturdy as doors, I don't know if I'd still have a dad point. TLDR, me, my sister and dad were stuck in a car as our neighbor blocked us in. He got out the car and my dad had a bad feeling and locked all the doors. Neighbor tried to smash the door window with his fist, but failed, and then went to get a tool to smash it with, but his partner turned up and stopped him. I guess it didn't really save my full life, more from the majority of victimization I could have faced. This is actually still happening as I'm writing this. Back in February, a few people and I played a game online together. None of us knew each other beforehand, but though the game, we all created a bond and decided to make a Twitter group chat. One of the people in the group, Sarah, yes, that is her real name, I have no sympathy for her privacy and you'll see why, begged to be put in the group chat too, even though none of us had really talked to her during the game. However, we added her since we figured we could get to know her. Right from the beginning, she seemed a little off to me, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to start anything or ruin anyone's fun. Then the DMs started. She would constantly hound my DMs, demanding I answer her, threatening self-harm or suicide if I was offline for too long. It didn't help I was preparing for a multi-day trip out of state where I wouldn't have time to be on my phone, nor Wi-Fi, and I don't have data. I told her this, but when I came back, I was bombarded by a mess of messages. I noticed she started doing this in the actual group chat too. I'd met the admin of the chat, Jack, fake name. I asked for something, anything to be done, because at this point I was breaking down. She was kicked, and I very quickly learned by the people saying someone actually kicked her, and oh thank God that I wasn't the only ones with problems with Sarah. The worst part is, everyone under 16 had been hounded in their DMs by her. Sarah is 23, almost 24. On top of that, when the group chat started we all disclosed our ages. She knew full well who she was talking to. We didn't think anything of her age, since we have a 22-year-old in the chat too who's very kind, and is still in there today. Anyway, Sarah blocked us all. When we kicked her a few days ago, she unblocked me in the morning, right before I left for school, and med me. I muted the chat, so I wouldn't have to deal with it until later at least. I come back after school, to find out she tried to get with and sent nudes to someone I knows. I'll call her Ann, girlfriend. Both Ann and her girlfriend are 17 and Sarah knew this. I publicly stated in response to Ann's tweet about Sarah that I believed her and was with her. Sarah saw this and sent me a DM about me taking Ann's side over hers. This part isn't important to how my gut was right, so I'll skip it, but it was a mess. After the mess with Ann and her girlfriend, a thread started of people who have been affected by Sarah. Obviously, most of the victims remained anonymous, but without us, my group chat, saying our experiences, or using the word pedophile. Most of the claims in the thread are from people who say they are underage and were repeatedly hit on by Sarah. Most have screenshots of their DMs to prove. One was an adult who had a baby, not even one yet. She said Sarah would say comments about how the baby would be a hottie someday and will be faking a lot of guys someday because she'll be able to. This is not even a 1-year-old baby. The worst part of this, I can prove this isn't a fake story for upvotes. Sarah's current Twitter handle, which I feel she'll either change or abandon looking for new victims eventually, is at COLORFULMAXX, and I can provide link to that thread of victims. https://twitter.com/Sarah, as of now, currently has her account set to private, but she quickly accepted one of my friends pretending to be a 15-year-old with no common interests of Sarah's. This was done just to confirm that she does look at ages, and also to keep tabs on what she says about people if she changes handles/abandons the account, and or concerts she's going to, so we can keep our common fandom safe. We have no intention into trying to get her to DM the account nor to trick her into saying anything or manipulating it to make her seem more like a bedo. She did that enough already. TLDR, my gut ended up saving the minors in my group chat from being victimized by a pedophile who even sexualizes literal babies younger than 1. The paragraph above includes evidence of the pedophile. I was very young at the time, probably barely starting grade school. My mom and I would always take a trip down to San Diego every summer to visit her relatives. This given summer we had gotten together with her cousin and their 2 boys, each a few years or so older than me, but not by much, and we had decided to go to the beach. Now I'm from an area with a lot of beaches, but none that are quite warm or surfing quality, so I was extremely excited to get a chance to go bodyboarding, especially since we had this spot all to ourselves. My mom and her cousin were sat on the beach, watching me and the 2 boys having a blast in the water. We had just rowed back down to the edge of the water from a small wave, and I jump up, grinning and running back towards the water after the boys. I stopped dead my tracks as I got this horrible feeling and a sort of tingling along the back of my neck. Then I just hear a voice say, "Don't go in the water." I turned to the boys and asked them if they said something, unsure of what I heard, as I didn't recognize the voice, and it had an odd deepness to it, but not like as in tone, but sort of resonance. They looked confused and insisted they hadn't said a thing, which creeped me the fuck out. I tried to shake it off and head back in, but the second the thought crossed my mind of entering the water, I heard "stay out of the water." At this point I was just scared and ran out to the shore. I remember they tried to get me back in and made fun of me for being so scared and reassured me that it was perfectly fine. The feeling of dread and premonition was so intense at this point I was almost to tears, trying everything I could to convince them to get out of the water and to stay on the shore, and that something here was terribly wrong, but no one would listen. My mom and her cousin tried to reassure me and calm me down, and were irritated by how fervently I was trying to get them out of the water, but I was not having it. I knew that something bad was going to happen. I was sure of it. I'll never forget that feeling of complete powerlessness as I felt sure somehow they'd die. And there was nothing I could do to stop it, and no one would believe me. The voice would keep coming and repeating that phrase, and it was distressing to the point where I just sat on the beach as close to the water as I could get without touching it, as I refused to so much as dip a toe in at this point, no matter what anyone said. I sat like this for what must have been at least an hour, doing nothing, saying nothing, and yet it barely felt like any time passed until it happened. A riptide. A faking riptide. I remember the panic. I remember my mom running into the water, and a very blurry memory of her dragging them ashore after a horrifying sequence of her desperately trying to do the seemingly impossible to me, but she managed to save them. My mom was a lifeguard for years, and not at pools, but at San Diego beaches, so she didn't fuck around. She knew what to do, and she did it. But I will never be able to forget what she said to me as we drove back to my grandparents' place shortly after the traumatic incident. "You know, it's a good thing you didn't go in the water, because there's no way I would have been able to save 3 kids." I was walking home from the train station one night. I got off at the stop before my usual, because I felt like walking more, even though it was late, almost midnight, had one headphone in, one out, like usual, and I heard a bunch of yelling a couple blocks ahead. Some homeless people were camped out in front of a church, and it seemed like someone was getting kicked out. A couple guys and a girl were standing on the corner and another guy was in the median of the road, arms spread wide, pacing, and screaming. The guys on the corner were telling him to fuck off. And the girl was trying to get everyone to calm down. Dude in the median screams something and crosses to the side of the road I'm on. I kept walking, head up but not too high, hands in my pockets, and my heart racing, and my mind convinced this is how I die. The dude yelled to me a few times, and I kept walking, but he was getting angrier and angrier that I wasn't answering him and no one else was around, so I said, "What's up?" He was tweaked the fuck out. I honestly don't even know what we talked about. I just tried to play it cool, like this was the most natural thing in the world. He kept pace with me, even though I was walking pretty quickly, rambling incoherently. I offered him a cigarette, and he took it, but wouldn't light it. Then he started talking about the magic, and how he needed to put the magic in everyone. I could help him. Crazy shit, like he wanted us to take over the world together. I knew I had to get away before I got too close to my house, because at that point we got to a busy intersection and stopped at the crosswalk together. He starts saying, "I just wanna put the magic in you, girl, help me kill those other ones." Oh shit, no. I walked right out into traffic across 6 lanes, and he starts screaming that I walked away from the magic and I'm gonna kill you, bitch. I didn't start running because I didn't want that to trigger him to start running. I walked so faking fast till I could turn down a residential street, and then I faking flew home, locked the doors right behind me, and stayed on the floor with the lights off for a good half hour after that. Jesus Christ. I don't get off at that train station late anymore, and if I get out of work really late, I'll suck it up and spend the money on a Lyft now. Late to the party as usual, but here goes. Many years ago, long before my wife and I were married, we were homeless together. We almost always had someone's couch we could crash on, but some nights we'd have to wait till late in the evening before we could go to wherever point. So we had been wandering around downtown on a Sunday night in, I think, this was 2002. So it was a long time ago. Late March, it was crappy cold, rainy weather, and it was starting to get late, so there was hardly anyone around. There's a tower at the main intersection of the downtown core that has a McDonald's, some other various stores, and some government offices and such. They all share the same public bathrooms, which are towards the back of the building. Point as my wife and I were entering to go use the bathrooms, there was a group of 6 people outside of the building. We mostly ignore them, and after we enter, my wife tells me she recognized one of them as a girl who used to bully her way back in like grade and 8. So many years previous. Point there's a main hallway you have to go through into a side hallway that leads to where the bathrooms are. I had to go, but something told me to be careful and just wait in the hall and hold it for now. Let my wife do her thing and get on our way. The small bathroom hallway has a turn in it, so when you walk down the hall, you make a quick left and then a quick right. So there's a little corner where there's a camera ball right outside the bathrooms. I was a little tired, so I would crouch/sit in the corner. I still have this habit where I will squat like a Slav, despite no Eastern European ancestry, and while I'm sitting there, the 3 girls pass me in the hall, are about to go into the bathroom. When they look to the side and see me sitting there instead of going into the bathroom, they suddenly turn around and leave. Point about 20 or so seconds later, the 3 guys come in and go past me. They didn't see me like the girls did. They go into the bathroom, then they come back out. Not nearly enough time for anyone to pull it out, let alone go to the bathroom. Walk past me, see me there, then they stop. Point the one who's clearly the leader turns around and says, "Why you eyeballing me?" I hadn't. I'd been doing my best to ignore them. I don't generally make eye contact with anyone and usually look at the ground. I just tell him I'm not. Pointy says, "Well, you're eyeballing me now." Of course I'm making eye contact now. He's talking to me. I know to look at people when I talk to them. I just don't look at people if I'm not interacting with them, and I just tell him that I'm not, and I'm only looking at him because he's talking to me. Point they just turn around and leave. Pretty sure they didn't do anything because the camera was right there and there were actually security guards who regularly patrol. Point they had very obviously been looking to attack us in the bathrooms. But because I stayed out of the bathrooms, it didn't get to go how they hoped. A few years ago I was walking home from the bar around 2 AM or so. I used to go to that bar every Monday because it fell on my day off and they had local metal bands that day every week. I didn't drink too much, but was coming down from a light acid trip. I lived about 3 miles away, not an abnormal walk for me, but I took a different road than normal. The road I normally took always made me uneasy at night because a girl was almost abducted there a few years ago. However, the one I took was mostly businesses that are only open during the day and not houses, making it a little more sketchy at night. Point when I would walk alone at night, I'd only ever put one earbud in so I could listen to music but still kind of be aware of my surroundings. As I'm walking, I get a really creeped out feeling. I grab my phone and pause the music. Just then, I can see headlights approaching from behind me. I start to feel my adrenaline rush, but try to keep calm while reaching in my backpack for my mace and or knife. Normally I carry these in hand while walking alone, but figured it wasn't a good idea that night because I was coming down from acid and was worried about what would happen if a cop saw me. The knife was an assisted open blade, which was technically illegal in that state. That's when the car pulls up to the curb next to me from across the other lane. He puts down his window and in a calm, friendly voice asks if I want a ride. I'm pretty scared and just shake my head no, not breaking a stride. He proceeds to slowly creep along with me, repeating his offer. I'm looking ahead and ignoring him, trying to walk as quickly as possible in the heeled boots I was in. Now he is angry and screaming at me to get in the car. I start running, trying to scan for somewhere to duck into if absolutely necessary. A flyer about 30 seconds of this, a car starts coming from the opposite way, and he sped off. I pretty much ran the rest of the mile home I still had, got inside and locked the door. Long story short, I'm glad I paused the music and pulled out my knife, otherwise I would have been caught unaware, and he may have tried something more drastic. Never took that road again, and felt pretty ashamed that I'd put myself in that situation. One time, my parents, my sister and I found some ice creams in the freezer that we didn't know were there. The moment we got them out, I felt that they must have been dodgy. The best before date said that they were fine, but something was not right. So my mum, my sister and I, or maybe just my sister and I forgot, each had an ice cream. We noticed that they tasted strange. Sort of like really cold cake, but it was ice cream. I took one bite and a nibble, but then I stopped. It was disgusting and dodgy. It knew it wasn't good for me to eat anymore, so I stopped there. My sister's didn't taste disgusting, so she kept eating. The next morning, I had terrible diarrhea. I felt like I was going to vomit too. My gut was in inescapable pain. I knew it was the ice cream. My sister turned out to be okay, but if I ate the entire thing, it could have been worse. After that, I learned that if something doesn't taste right, don't eat it. It could be food poisoning. Another food poisoning story to do with this theme. Every Tuesday night, my mum used to buy these Asian takeaway dinners that were healthy. Some takeaway is healthy where I live. Anyway, they always tasted wrong. I didn't know what it was or how to explain it, but something was wrong. They weren't disgusting, just weird tasting. I would only eat a small amount before deciding that I just couldn't have more. Especially after the ice cream incident, I became more picky about my food. Anyway, my mum didn't usually eat these. One night she did, and she spent the rest of that night awake vomiting up the dinner. We never had those dinners again. This one wasn't my gut feeling, but my parents. That saved me from a big trouble. Before I start, I need to establish that English is not my first language. There may be some grammatical errors. When I started almost the last year to finish school, I got an invitation to a party, the one where you rent a limousine and go to a nightclub to hang out with your friends, but in this case with your classmates. It was a pretty nice way to get to know with the course and do something different. I even paid the whole trip and was looking to pay extra money for some drinks, non-alcoholic ones. That day when I got home from school, I was waiting for my dad to let him know he had to come pick me up when the party was over, but he didn't show up, so I stayed that night. The next day I found out that the party were a little bit of trash, and one of the girls that went to the party ended up having some sort of intoxication for alcohol and drugs. Turns out that someone on the party brought LSD and cocaine, I guess, and was passing it on to everyone. All of the class was scared and tried to hide the whole thing. Meanwhile, I was laughing miles off at home with my mom for how my dad's bad habit saved me. That girl came 3 days later without any other problems, and even her doctor lied to her parents about the drugs and just told them that she passed out because of the alcohol. But for the whole class, that was a traumatic event that they will never forget anymore. One night I'm out with a friend, my brother and my girlfriend at the time. I live in a big city, so everything is open really late. It was probably 9 or 10, and it was pitch dark. We were standing outside a GameStop talking about going across the parking lot to a Dairy Queen when two sketchy looking teenagers came from the back of the shopping plaza. I was the oldest at 15 years old, and the sketchy teenagers looked to be just out of high school, around 18 to 20. They approached us and started talking to my girlfriend. They obviously had an interest in her, as they said nothing to either my friend, brother or I. I instinctively felt uneasy and looked for anyone around. Nearby there was a supermarket with people going in and out, but it was far enough from the GameStop for us likely not to reach it if we had to jet. They began asking, "How are you doing? And why don't you hang with us?" All of my group got the same weird vibes from them. I grabbed my girlfriend and swung her behind my friend, brother and me. I looked the dudes in the eyes and told them to go away. They laughed and asked if she was my girlfriend. I told them yes, and they laughed. They walked back where they came from, still turning around to look at us as they went. My blood was cold and pulse was racing. I still ponder the nightmare that would have happened if my friend, brother and I weren't there. All of us have never even spoken about the incident. I hope they never did hurt anyone, and I was just being paranoid. I actually have two stories with similar circumstances. Not long ago, I was on a walk with my slightly older sister. We do these walks almost every evening at what's usually around 5 to 6, but we had eaten dinner So we ended up going out at about 7 p.m. It was around that time. It wasn't exactly dark, but it wasn't light either. We were walking down the street when we passed by two girls, almost adults but not quite, although I may be wrong. I got serious chills when walking past, so I slightly fastened my pace and my sister, confused, followed. One of the girls was sitting on the fence of one of the properties, although it didn't look like she lived there. The other girl was standing next to her, and they were both quietly giggling. So, around 15 to 20 minutes later, we turn around and start heading back the way we came, on the opposite side of the street. We spot the area where we saw the girls, and I see one of them is running across from our side of the road to the other side. When we finally pass them, I hear footsteps behind us, and the feeling comes back full pelt. We up our speed a little bit, then a little more, until we are not running, but it's close. As we get further away the steps get quieter, and I swear I hear a "wait, come back" from behind me, but neither of us turned around. Later, we decided that they were quite possibly high. The second takes place the exact same way, but walking in the complete opposite direction. It's 6 to 7, more dark than usual, not full on night but pretty dark, and we've already been walking for around half an hour. It's not uncommon to see people also talking a walk, but when my stomach turned, I looked around for the cause, and saw a flash of orange. The cause of that flash, I noticed, was a guy on the other side of the street, lighting a cigarette. From what I could see from the not very good lighting, he was wearing a large jacket, maroonish. Keep in mind that it was dark, so I'm not sure. Anyway, he looked pretty sketchy, unshaven, dirty, hunched shoulders. I always try not to judge people based on their looks, but this guy actually gave me what I can only describe as a sort of sinking feeling. I shivered, deciding I was overreacting, because I obviously never learned from the last time I got a gut feeling. I continued walking. It didn't take long for the two of us to realize he was behind us. A distance away, sure, but still behind us. The strange thing was, he had been on the other side of the street, and walking in the opposite direction. The feeling was majorly worse. I had full on goosebumps and my hands were clenched, but it wasn't cold. It was quite warm, actually. So we continue, though carefully, when we hear a twig snap, and, after trying to nonchalantly look behind us, he's closer. So we walked down another street, and turned left down the next. Only, once we reached halfway, to cross it, and walk right down the way we came. What scared us the most? He followed our exact movements. Thankfully, by then, we were already walking, well, more like borderline sprinting, back the way we came. We heard twigs snapping behind us, but 2 or so blocks later it was once more silent. We didn't stop running until we reached our apartment. My sister also mentioned that he looked a lot like the guy who had robbed us a year ago. The dude stole a large jar of coins, but left all the jewelry, probably looking for cash for a quick fix. If I hadn't had the feeling, I wouldn't have seen that guy. If I hadn't had that feeling, I might have stopped for those 2 girls. If I did any of that, who knows where me and my sister would be now? I actually have multiple of these, but this one is the most Reddit-worthy. The other 2 both come from my time as an rap. The first was a male resident who had injured himself in a ski accident pretty close to campus late at night. It turned out to be a broken collarbone and 2 broken ribs. He called me asking if campus security could get him to a place with medical attention. I knew this resident very well, and knew he had a stubborn and cheap streak. I didn't hear a sound to indicate it, and there was nothing that could have hinted it to me, but I knew how stubborn he was and knew if he was asking me this, he was not in an ambulance. I got pretty cross with him and told him pull over now. He was shocked enough that I could tell he was driving himself on his injury that he pulled over. He had barely said how could you tell? That I heard the screech of metal and obvious sound of a collision in the background. A car had spun out of control immediately after passing him and hit a tree far over the speed limit. It was a drunk driver. The rest of the road was pretty empty, a low traffic 1-lane road in the middle of nowhere. My resident called 911 and they were able to get an ambulance to the driver in time. and an ambulance already being there also convinced my resident to go to the hospital. I shudder to think what would happen if my resident had not pulled over, or if no one had been there to call to get that drunk driver help. For backstory, after work I help people with school subjects like math for example. I do it just to help. The person that bought that place pays me for the help. I usually walk from home to work and vice versa. It's only 10 minutes, so it's not a problem. A week ago, when I finished with the last children and went to home, cross the road as usual, then I passed across two motorcycles that for some reason they were on the sidewalk, but I didn't pay up attention to them because they disappeared from my sight kinda fast. I continued my usual path to home and then went to some sort of hall that is on the sidewalk. I always go because cuts half of the walk to home, but for some reason I couldn't. Something said to me that I shouldn't go. I had that on my head as fast as I step only a bit on that hall. After a while thinking I just took the long way home. My mother like 30 minutes later calls me worried sick asking me that if I was alright. I replied that I was fine and asked why that question and that tone of voice. It's very easy to notice when my mother is nervous about something because her voice cracks a lot. She told me that someone was robbed at that street where that hall actually ends. When I hear that I was in pure shock, couldn't even respond. 2 days later they found that mugged that person. I don't know if they were the two on the motorcycles, but it would be normal as in Argentina it's sadly common to people to get mugged from someone on a motorcycle. Sorry if my English is bad or broken. I'm actually trying a lot to improve, and when I saw this question I wanted to share my story, even if it's not on my native language. I know I'm late, but whatever, last year in October there was my favorite singer was on tour, and I had gotten a concert ticket as a gift from my grandma. The problem was it was like 500 kilometers away, which is considered far in my country and all through Europe, but I was 17 and my mother wouldn't allow me to go to the concert in Amsterdam, and basically told me I needed to go to Berlin because my uncle lives there, and she didn't want me in another country. So we set it all up and everything went smoothly. I went on my way by train and bus. When I got there everything was okay. As I arrived 5 hours before the concert, I made a stroll from the tram to a supermarket and McDonald's, and then took a stroll through a park to get to a bus stop that would get me to the location. I had met up with some people there, and we waited to get in. But after the supporting act I felt my breath getting hitched, and my heart start to pound. So I went out and smoked a cigarette to calm down. As I went back in I first wanted to get back to my friends, but nearly got into a fight and I could feel a panic attack hit. So now the concert was about to start. I was alone and panicked. So I went upstairs where less people were, and I still had a good sight. After the concert I was still crying, and now my phone went crazy and shut off. Now I didn't know where to go, and I was alone again. Before I could even text anyone. But I had the phone number of my other uncle on my arm because I lived with him, and went back to the venue and called him. But the lady that was so kind and let me use her phone was so kind and brought me to the next major tram station where she needed to go. I was still shaken up, but pulled myself together. As I got into my tram she told me everything was fine and I drove off. But I suddenly got really anxious again and there was this guy staring at me the whole ride from the other side of the car. So I went into another one at the next station, where more people. I got in pretending I saw a friend. Then I ducked away, so he couldn't see me, and pretended to talk to my uncle on the phone. When I finally got to the station and got out he was standing on the platform too, but I already saw my uncle in the distance, so I nearly ran up to him and hugged him. The guy literally got into the tram that went the other way as it pulled up a minute later. Hadn't my uncle been there I'm sure something would have happened. I know this isn't as bad as the others, but it was very traumatic for me. But it was my only bad concert experience. Happened a while back, in October of 2018, on my birthday. My mom and I were at a hotel near California, parked in the back, and organizing our car, since we had just bought some stuff in Nevada, before heading down to Cali. In the back parking space the night before there was military cars / military people in the back of people there staying that night, and save for our car, there was only one other car in the morning, burgundy red, don't know the make and model, but it was a V4 for sure. There was a guy, tall, roughly 5 feet 12, skinny but had a little muscle on his arms, medium brown skin, dark brown hair, can't remember eye color, looked a little disheveled, 27-ish, in the front seat, driver's side. He glanced at us when we walked through, but I never caught him looking at us again, but I got a weird feeling without knowing why. When my mom and I were walking back and forth from the hotel room to our car, I noticed the guy in the car, but didn't take much mind to it, but did realize how often I looked back at the car when I caught myself staring just a little too long. Fast forward to an hour later after my mom and I cleaned the car out, my mom hands me the keys and tells me to get something we forgot inside the car. Believed it was something for laundry. As I'm approaching the car, already on the pavement, the same guy once in the car approaches me with a smile and says he needs his car jumped. His trunk is now open and the jumper cables are on the ground, right in front of the open trunk. I got a bad feeling about the guy. Here's how the conversation went. Guy, hey, my car's dead and I need a jump. Me, acting like I'm not creeped out. Okay, guy, I got the jumper cables right here. Points to the cables on the ground. Me, okay, let me get my mom. I'm not familiar with doing this. His expression turned weird as I walked back to the hotel room. I locked the hotel room door and told my mom the situation, and upon hearing it, she told the front desk. The woman was definitely distressed from the tone of her voice and offered to call the police. To jump his car. Never knew what really happened or who the guy was, but when I went back out with my mother the car was gone. I'm a little person, about 5 feet 2 and female, alongside young. He cold grabbed me while I was getting the cables and stuffed me in the trunk. Creeps me out to this day. Don't know if I was in life trouble, but I would probably have been robbed or some shit like that. I'm a boy, but when I was walking home one day at around 3 o'clock in the morning from a party, I walked by this gas station which was a shortcut to get home. It was disconnected from the main road. I spotted a guy sitting in his car, but thought fuck it, we live in a safe town. It wasn't unusual for cars to be parked there, since we have a lot of kids doing drugs etc. Eventually as I walked past him, probably 20 meters after the gas station, I got this weird vibe. I walked a little bit faster. As I turned around maybe 100 meters later I learned that he was following me in his car. At this point I had hit a grocery store, which of course was closed. The area is pretty big and there is a turn onto the main road again, and there is another shortcut which would lead to an ATM that eventually leads into the place where supplies for the store gets delivered. Luckily there is a few bushes you can't see from driving past it in a car. I hide behind them. I wait patiently as he is passing by the bushes, probably expecting me to be in the supply lot point. As soon as he passed the bushes, I ran for it, looking back every now and then. He did drive into the supply lot, expecting me there. Eventually I made it to the bus station where I decided, stupid idea, hide again. After a good 10 minutes or so, I decided to head home. As I'm walking up the street, I see the car down the road. Luckily for me, he was turning the wrong direction. I head back home, eventually calling my dad to meet me halfway there. Thanks for being up late. I tell him everything, and he is kinda weirded out by it too, since there never really have been any weird very illegal stuff going on since we moved here. I call my friends who were still at the party that there were a possible threat in the city, so they all sleep at his house. To this day, I really stopped thinking about it. This was 8 months ago, and nothing sinister has happened in the city since. I made a little map for you. If my explaining got a little confusing, or if you're just curious, main road is 449. Yellow, me brown, the guy in the car green, bushes red, gas station blue, supply area. https://jayazo.com/. This just happened today, and I thought about this question. Today me and 3 of my friends were going to the park, and one of them says we should go because 2 girls on Snapchat are there and they like him. Me and my 2 other friends keep telling him he shouldn't go, but he does anyways. But we go with him just in case he's safe. We get there and the girls are there and they are complete and utter a-holes and blow smoke in my face. So does my friend, well call him Jake, and my 2 other friends John and Jaden. After they blow smoke in my face, John and Jaden say to me that I should leave and they'll meet me back at Jaden's house. Of course I deny because I wanted to be there for my friend and stuck my ground, but something told me in my stomach to leave, so I did. Fast forward 15 minutes later, I'm worried that my friends aren't coming back since I'm at Jaden's house, and I leave to go look and I see Jake riding his bike down the hill. His look on his face said him genuinely terrified. I asked what happened and he didn't respond, but when Jaden and John came running down the hill, they told me everything. Turns out when I left, the girls started taking Jake's phone 2 times and started saying we are selling them. So John and Jaden step in and saying harsh stuff to them because they kept messing with Jake. Since the girls live in a bad neighborhood in my borough, the girls got on the phone, which means they are getting people to beat up my friends and started chasing my friends. Trigger warning. Rap. When I was about 12 I used to wear my hair in long plaited pigtails every day. I also had a round face and walked back from the bus stop every day in my Catholic school uniform. This gets relevant in a minute, I promise. It was about a 20-minute walk, but I never really thought anything of it because I knew the route pretty well and there were a few people I knew along the way who I could go to if I needed. One freezing afternoon in the middle of winter I get a message from my mother saying she would pick me up and take me home because she didn't want me to slip in the snow and to wait near the bus stop for her. So I did. I sat on the wall and waited. A few minutes later a silver car with black doors pulls into the bus stop and a man winds down his window, leaning out a little. "Hey," he shouts out to me. "Get in. Your mum sent me to come get you." I didn't recognize the man, but my mother had just started a new job and I didn't know any of her co-workers yet. I didn't move, so he called out to me again. "Come on love, it's freezing out here. I'm your mum's friend from work." I knew my mum worked with a man who was short, white, and bald, and this man matched that description, so I took a few steps closer. Then I stopped abruptly. Something just didn't feel right. I remember staring at him for a few seconds and beginning to back up, and as I did, so he unlocked his car door and began to open it. I don't know what came over me, but I started running, glancing back just to see him slam his door closed and drive off. The light had just turned to green and there were cars coming in the other direction. He evidently didn't want to be seen. I ran around the corner and texted my mother my new location, then explained to her what had happened. We went to the police station, but they passed it off as a case of mistaken identity and pushed us away. I just couldn't shake the horrible feeling of that man away. A few months later a post from a girl I went to school with came up in my Facebook feed that brought the feeling back. She'd been walking home from school when a sliver car had pulled over to her, and a woman had told her that she was there to pick her up. She said there was a man in the passenger seat, and they said they were her mother's friends from work, and that she'd sent them to get her. She ran home, told her mother, and reported it to the police, but again it was passed off as mistaken identity. No links were made between her case and mine. Not long after, both of our cases were dropped. A few years after our cases were dropped I see something in the news that makes my stomach drop. The police have taken a man into custody in the neighboring town. He was short, white, and bald, and he drove a silver car with black doors. It was said that he'd been luring girls into his car, then forcing them to take their clothes off so he could take pictures, which then ended up on the dark web, before letting them go and blackmailing them not to tell anyone. Apparently he'd been doing it over the course of 2 years, until he finally kidnapped a girl, took her back to his house in the neighboring town, raped her, and killed her. I knew immediately it was the same man who tried to get me, and I've thought what would have happened if I'd listened to him 100 times. He's in prison now, but I don't know for how long. Now what made it really scary too? Every girl he kidnapped/attempted to kidnap wore their hair in plaited pigtails, had a round face, and wore a Catholic school uniform. We were all alone when we were approached, and all approached when it was dark, and we were vulnerable. I spent years living with the burden of his actions and the guilt of what happened to those other girls. Why wasn't it me? Why did I fit what he was looking for? Why did it take a murder for police to arrest him? The silence of my small town was broken, and ever since people have been on edge. No one goes out after dark anymore. We are all living in fear. Over time I went through lots of therapy and met some people who understood. I wanted to meet up with the other victims, but I was worried that they'd hate me because I was one of the lucky ones. Then this summer I aged out of Catholic school, so I donated all of my uniforms. Then I, and a few others, finally took matters into our own hands and cut off my plaits. It was as though we were finally breaking away from him and what he did. It was emotional because the trauma came right back, but it's still one of the most healing things I've ever done. I know this was super long. Sorry. When I was still pretty new to Boy Scouts, about 11 or 12, my stepbrother and stepfather and me were heading to a camp out, with my stepfather driving, of course. This is a pretty rural area, so there's a lot dirt roads and farm equipment, etc. It had rained the night before and quite a bit during the week, and it was most likely going to rain that night, so it was even darker out than usual. We accidentally made a wrong turn onto an old dirt road that we thought was right, and we kept driving down it a bit through a decent amount of mud before dead-ending into a small patch of grass and mud with some tractors and other equipment scattered around. At this point we realized something wasn't right and started to turn around by doing something like an 8-point turn, and after about 2 to 3 turns we got stuck in mud. After a bit of struggling with going back and forth, we eventually managed to get going backwards when I got a gut feeling and just told him not to back up anymore in about as serious a tone I could muster at that age. He looked back at me and asked why, and I responded with something feels off, don't back up any farther, and he looked at me and said okay and put it in drive and did as hard of a turn as he could to get back on the dirt path, and we made it to camp without any more problems. When we left Sunday morning he decided to turn down it and see where we were, and we saw our tire tracks in the mud. Had we gone back even another inch we would have been sent down a massive 20 to 30 foot deep ravine and probably died. A few years ago, my wife and I were leaving a performance of Engelbert Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel by the Washington National Opera at the Kennedy Center, and I noticed a pretty well-known political journalist by the name of Roger Simon. I'd never met the guy, but I'd always admired his writing, so I introduced myself and my wife and struck up a conversation. We chatted a bit, and then he mentioned that he was heading to a post-show party with a bunch of the singers, some of the orchestra, and most of the board, and he invited us along. We are not from DC, so this sounded pretty cool. We got our coats and headed to the parking lot, which was pretty much like any other large-scale underground lot, in that they always feel a little unsafe. But this was just eerie. As we got deeper into the lot, the guy started talking more and more about his father, how they'd had a difficult relationship, how violent he was, how he still lived at home with his father. I had this increasing sense of impending doom, and so did my wife. Suddenly an older man leapt from behind a panel van and started beating him senseless with a set of jumper cables. As I watched in horror, I could see that there was a distinct family resemblance, and despite how old he was, the father appeared to have had a lot of experience handling those cables as weapons. The son took his beating without a whimper of complaint, pulled out his phone, and started posting to Reddit. Needs some setup. So, I do not like talking on the phone. Usually I only talk to someone in an emergency. I'm always a texting kind of guy. When my dad calls, however, it's always plain old annoying. Usually it's something trivial like the name of a street they're on when they can just go into a nearby business and ask. Second, because they always call my phone and waste my credit despite the fact I'm antisocial to the point where I rarely leave the house, so why not use the landline, since my goddamn phone doesn't work, ironically, in my own house. He also never calls me when he's at work or when I'm on a course or something. Now, I'm in class one day and things were a bit hectic over the weekend. Aunt was sick, suddenly took a turn for the worst, but we were all told by the doctors that was recovering and would leave the hospital soon. Well, I go into class and, against my mum's suggestion, Since it wasn't likely, I tell my tutor about my aunt, and if anything happened I'd have to leave early under the pretext that my mum was a close relative, and if anything happened, mum would want to be there to take care of her. So, about an hour or two later I'm sitting in class and doing work on the computer, since it was a course on the Microsoft Office suite, when there is suddenly the sound of a cat screeching outside the window which freaks everyone out. I'm suddenly nervous since I, who is Irish, know for a fact that several of my cousins on my mum's side have claimed to hear a banshee when a relative has passed away. Mum's heard it, my aunts and uncles heard it, my cousins have heard it. Anyway, I decide to open up the bus services site and look at the schedule since I feel like I need to get on a bus as soon as fucking possible. The only reason I didn't leave is because I actually needed pretext. Half an hour later, my phone rings. It's my dad calling. I picked it up, and the first thing he said was, "Your aunt took a turn for the worst this morning. She died not too long ago." The only reason I didn't leave immediately was because I just missed the bus as soon as he called. It's a 5-minute walk to the station. I was excused at the lunch break half an hour later, so I could get something to eat before I got home, since I'd be expected to help